Okay, we just finished bleeding the front brakes here. One thing I will mention about the front brakes is if you have a dual caliper bike, depending on how the front brake lines are routed on this bike, it goes from the master cylinder down to a union, and that union separates in a line to each caliper. If you have a bike that runs this line from the master cylinder straight down to your caliper, and then a line from one caliper to the other caliper, you always want to start bleeding from the caliper that's farthest away from the master cylinder. So if your line runs from master cylinder down to your right brake caliper and then over to your left one, always start bleeding from your left one, and that's just because pressure kind of pushes everything to the left since the left is on the end, so all your air should be in the left one. It doesn't always work that way. You're not going to hurt anything if you start with the right side instead of the left side in that situation. It's just, it'll save you a little time sometimes if you do it that way. But transitioning to the rear brakes here, sometimes these can be kind of hidden. For example, this bike has a cover that covers up your master cylinder. Your master cylinder's down there, it covers up your reservoir. Sometimes bikes have a nice square master cylinder that sits out here, and it's part of your master cylinder. You can see it, it's easy to get to. Sometimes they will be hidden under a cover like this. The easiest way, if you can't find it, the easiest way to tell where it's at is to look where your brake line runs from your rear caliper, should come up to your master cylinder, and then you should have another line, which is this one right here, that runs somewhere. And it's a brake line, so it's a pretty significant line. You just follow it and it'll take you to wherever your reservoir is. In this case, took the battery out as well, just sometimes it's a little easier to get to things. Once again, this is kind of where your syringe and especially the battery vent line come in hand, as it's kind of hard to get to this. But if you pop your cap off of it, and I'll pull the cap off here so you can see it. And these are a pain to get off sometimes, so they're twisted on there. However, you can't always fit your hand in there to grab them. So if you need to put some pliers on it or whatnot to grab it, you can. Just be careful. You don't want to squeeze it too much and crack it. But this is what it looks like. Just your cap. Once again, it says .4 on it like it should. And these have a similar setup on the inside. Once again, it is a cap, and then you have a rubber piece and a plastic piece. Sometimes they'll be stuck together pretty good. Separate them and just be careful, because once again, there will be brake fluid or moisture in here. You don't want to spill it everywhere. But two pieces again. Now, these can be a pain to fill up and drain just because of where they're at. Everything's in the way. This is once again where your brake vent line, or your battery vent line, excuse me, and your little syringe here come in handy. I put the battery vent line on my syringe in this case, and then you can get it to wherever it needs to go. Just stick it down in there and suck it out. And once again, we're sucking it out of there, otherwise you're going to have to pump all that through the system, and it just takes longer. It's easier to just get it out of there, fill it up with fresh, that way you don't have to pump all the bad out. Go ahead and just put this back in whatever container you were draining into before. Go ahead and take it off of here. Now, as long as if you're using a syringe, just make sure the majority of your bad fluid's out. There's going to be a little bit left. You can't get it out. It's fine. It is what it is. But I'm going to use this then to actually pull from the brake fluid container itself. Maybe here, and if you need to, in this case I do, since my fluid's low in that container, I'm actually going to use this vent line here to pull some brake fluid out of there. Now, nothing really changes from the front brake to the rear brake as far as, how you're doing it, what you're doing. You're just kind of pressing a pedal instead of, pulling in a lever. Other than that, it's essentially the same thing. Now, some of these plastic reservoirs like this one, being a rear one, is plastic. They will kind of fade, deteriorate in color over time. They never come apart or leak or anything like that, but they'll get kind of a weird tint to them. So you can't always look at these and determine how good the brake fluid is, because some of these will be stained and it'll look dark even though the brake fluid's okay. Good rule of thumb is you're supposed to do your brake fluid every 2 years. I cannot stress that enough. Bikes that don't have ABS, you can get away with going a little bit longer. Once they start to, you get brake fade, then you should do it. But bikes with ABS, you need to do every 2 years. If you do not, you are taking a big chance, and a very expensive chance. If you don't get your brake fluid flushed every 2 years, it'll turn into like a gunk almost, is the only way I can describe it. It'll turn into like a Coca-Cola, and then you'll get this white sludge that builds up, and it will clog lines. It will clog your ABS pump, and ABS pumps, for example, on some of the old BMWs can be $4,000. They are not cheap, and a lot of times they are buried in the middle of your bike, so they are not easy to get to. It can be a very, very expensive fix if you do not keep up with your brake fluid. So especially if you have ABS on your bike, do it every 2 years. I don't care if your brakes feel great after year 3 or 4. You might get to year 6 and they go terrible, and then you take it to a dealer and they say, hey, you didn't do this every 2 years, now you need a $4,000 ABS pump. So every 2 years, just do it. But got my fresh brake fluid in here, gonna go ahead and put that in my reservoir. And once again, I'm gonna fill it up. This one, the rear ones usually have, the plastic ones have a upper and a lower. I'm gonna fill it up a little bit above the upper, just since I know I'm sucking the majority of it out here. Try not to make a mess. And if you come back to your rear one here, it's the same style bleeders on the front, another 8mm. Sometimes they're 10s. It just depends. Just make sure you're using the right size wrench so you don't round it out. Once again, that's a pain if you round them out. Put your hose on your bleeder there. Now, on this, some rear calipers can kind of be a pain, some front can as well. There's tight, there's not a lot of room to work. Sometimes if you put the box end with your wrench on before you put your line on, it helps. But it just depends. If there's not a lot of room, you can buy mini wrenches, essentially, is what I have here, which helps. And once again, same concept here. You want to pump it up a couple times. These rear ones that have a reservoir like this, a plastic reservoir, they don't shoot everywhere. You don't have to worry about it. If they have a metal one with like a square top and it's right on your master cylinder, they may shoot everywhere. So you want to put a cap back on them so it doesn't get all over your bike, especially because of where they're at. You get brake fluid in there, you're never going to get it all out. Go ahead and pump up your rear pedal. Give it a couple pumps here. And then crack your bleeder loose. Of course, this one's not going to be easy since I don't have a lot of room. Now, I loosened it a little bit, but it's not loose enough for anything to come out. So I'm going to take my box end back off. If it's tight and you can't get it, always use a box end because it has more grip. You're not going to round it out. And just crack it loose so it turns just a little bit. And then if you have to, just tighten it enough so nothing's coming out, and then switch back to your other end. Just because in this case I couldn't turn it enough because I was hitting my exhaust. But now I got it back on there and it's somewhat loose. There we go. Now, once again, as you're pressing this and cracking it loose, your brake pedal here should go down pretty far. Nothing wrong with that. That's what it's supposed to do. I'm going to go ahead and pump it up here with it loose to get all this bad brake fluid out. Once again, just keep an eye on your reservoir up here. You don't want to go below the lower, because if you do, you're sucking air into the system, and then you just made this process infinitely longer. Save a little room there, and press it down and hold it. And once I'm holding it, I'm going to go ahead and tighten it back up here. Now, if you have 2 syringes and 2 battery brake lines, you can just use 2, so you don't have to keep switching them back and forth here. But I'm almost out of fluid, so I got to fill it up again. And because of where it's at, it's a pain to get to, so I have to use a syringe. Fill it up pretty full again. Put my line back on my bleeder. Do the same thing I just did. Pump it up, hold it. Break it loose. Put it loose, I'm going to pump until I get what I need. Now, my fluid is nice and clear coming out of here, so I know I'm getting the fresh fluid through. I know that my line is clear since I'm getting fresh fluid out of here. Once you get clear fluid out of this, you're good to go. I've got it just now at the upper mark of my reservoir, so I'm going to pump it one more time and close it. Now with it closed here, I'm not going to take it off or anything since I don't have to go to the other side and do the other side since it's a rear. I'm going to now try and get my air bubbles out just like I did in the front. So pump it up a couple times. Once again, this is not moving a whole lot, so there's not a whole lot of air in it. If you get a lot of movement, it means you got quite a bit of air bubbles in it. Nothing wrong with that, you'll get them out. But pump it a couple times, hold it, crack it. Didn't see any air come out. I'm going to close it. So now my bleeder's closed. Now I'm going to let go of my brake pedal since I'm trying to get the air out. Now I didn't see any air bubbles and this feels really solid. However, I always go a time or two more after I'm done seeing bubbles just to kind of make sure. If you only get one time without bubbles, there's nothing wrong with that. I always like to do it 2 or 3 times just to be sure. So once again, pump it, crack it, and there are bubbles. Okay, go ahead and tighten it. It's tight. Once again, you don't have to tighten this to the moon. And then let it go. And you're good. And I am just under my upper line on my reservoir up here. So that is good. I'm not going to put any more in there, especially since this rubber grommet takes up space again. Pull my bleeder line off of here. And at this point, if you need to, go ahead and put some more in the reservoir if your reservoir is low. Once again, mine is not. So I'm going to go ahead and clean here. Wipe all your pieces off that are going back in. Once again, this one is plastic, not metal, so it's not going to hurt it if it's got a little bit of brake fluid on it, but I always like to clean it up, just kind of a habit. And the rubber piece goes in the first. Then your plastic cap, if you have one. Most bikes do, but there are some that don't. And then your cap again, and once again, being a screw on and kind of hard to get to, you want to make sure it's tight. However, you don't need to tighten these to the moon. They're not going to come off. Tighten it on there. Get your brake cleaner. Go ahead and wipe off the bleeder screw here. So if you drip anywhere, go ahead and wipe that off as well. It's always good to look, especially when you're using a syringe, to fill up back here, that it didn't drip anywhere down here that you didn't see. It doesn't look like it did. And at that point, everything's back together tight. Just pump it a couple times and make sure it's good. If you have the luxury of having a center stand, or you have your rear wheel on the ground, off the ground, you can always spin it a little bit by hand and hit your brake and just make sure it's working. Looks like it is. I'm gonna go ahead and put my rubber cap back on. And everything's tight, everything's filled up. I'm gonna put my cover back on here in a minute. But other than that, our brake bleed is done. I will tell you, after you do a brake bleed, especially if you've never done it before, as long as you have pressure, you're good. Anything soft, you can get all the air out. However, I always like to just, ride it down the driveway. If you have a side street, that you live on, just take it down the street slowly. Just make sure your brakes work, before you go ripping down the highway at 70 and find out you forgot to tighten something and, you don't have any brakes. So just take it slow for the first ride, make sure everything works, and then you can have at it. Other than that, that's it. I hope if you have any questions, please let me know. Ride safe out there. And once again, if you do not want to do this, don't want to mess with this, please bring it to Richardson Motoworks. We'll get you taken care of. I'm happy to do it, and I'll always be here. Thank you. You can learn more about us at richardsonmotoworks.com.